Hello, guys. Just started the live stream, obviously, and welcome back. We'll be getting to the lecture part in 10 minutes, so countdown starting now. And hope you're all doing well. Had a good weekend. So just chill and get comfortable, and we'll be ready to roll in 10 minutes. Hey, Jimin, good to see you. Just getting here early. That's always nice. Hey, Violet, welcome back. Good to see you too. Santino, good to see you. Welcome back. Leanne, nice. Thank you. Juliet, welcome back. Good to see you. Hi. Just another 6 minutes. Eddie's just really being a lovey-dovey guy today. Hey, have it over here. No? Okay. Oh, that's Eddie. Yeah, big boy. It's probably like close to 17 pounds. But yeah, him and his sister. 2 cats, and they're really cute, obviously. So he's about to have his birthday. Actually, it's going to be on Saturday, turning 5 years old. So. Cool. Just a little under 5 minutes to go. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, Eddie's the best. Him and both Peachy. Hi Jennifer, welcome back. Jasmine, thank you. Good afternoon. Michelle, welcome back. Rosemary, great to see the gang here showing up for the lecture. And yeah, we do have another 4 minutes till we get to 4 p.m. So just hanging in there. About 3 minutes to go till we start up. Justin, welcome back. Good to see you too. 2 minutes, and then we're going to get going. Jasmine, welcome. Both Jasmines, welcome. Jasmine M. Carson, welcome back. Not to worry, yeah, it's always good to be early. I heard the early bird gets the worm. Poria, good to see you. Mary Jane, thank you guys. Thanks. Andrea, welcome back. Nick, good to see you too. And we're getting down to the last couple moments and then we'll get started. Elena, welcome back too. Good to see you. Natalia, nice, good to see you. Hey. All right, then. So we're pretty much now at 4 p.m. Therefore, I'm just going to get the comments and lecture topic underway. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a great weekend. I hope everybody was able to take note that I did send your scores and scans for the midterm over the weekend and part of it on Monday. Hey, Tyler and Daniel. So if you haven't had a chance, just make sure you do check it out so that you're aware of your result for that. And we're just going to continue going forward in the schedule according to the calendar that you see in the syllabus. So right now we're partway through our topic on war, terrorism, and torture. And we've done a couple lectures already. So we talked about the overall different philosophical positions on the moral justifiability of war, realism, anti-war pacifism, just war theory. We talked about the different conditions of the just war theory. And then we started to develop our notes on the article by Douglas Lackey, who argues in favor of pacifism. Now, we've almost finished all the notes on the Lackey, but there's a little bit left over. So I want to start by just kind of wrapping up what he had to say. Karen, Anthony, Julian, Daniel, everybody, good to see you guys. So yeah, we got to wrap up the notes on Lackey, and then we'll move on to the counter argument, the opposing argument against what he's saying. That'll be the main thing for today, the thing by Jan Narveson, or is it Jan Narveson? I think it might be. But okay, so let me just kind of recap and summarize the stuff that we did get through last time as we were finishing or trying to finish the notes on Lackey. So, okay, Douglas Lackey's article is just called Pacifism. And first off, what he does is he says that to really be holding pacifism as a moral position, you can't just say what he calls live and let live pacifism. That means that you can't just be like thinking, well, I don't want to use violence or kill people, but if other people do it, live and let live. Different strokes for different folks. If you want to use violence, I'm not going to judge you, but I just personally don't like it. That, he says, is not a true moral position, though, what he calls live and let live pacifism. Because if you actually believe that something is wrong, then you don't just think it's wrong for you to do it. You think it's wrong for anybody to do it. So if I think that it's wrong for people to commit rape, that doesn't just mean that I wouldn't do it, but I'm not going to judge other people. It means that I don't believe anyone should do it, and I hold people in moral judgment if they do that. So that's his first thing to clarify. If you're really a pacifist and you're going all the way and holding that as a moral position, not just as a lifestyle preference or personal preference, then it needs to be a moral code that you would, at least in principle, apply to everybody. He then distinguished these different 4 types of pacifism. So one he calls anti-killing pacifism, or maybe I've labeled it as that because that's the basic idea of it. And its perspective is that it's wrong to kill. Another form of pacifism is universal pacifism, which goes even farther and says it's wrong to even just use violence at all, even if it doesn't involve killing. And then there's private pacifism, which holds the position that if you're going to act in a violent way personally, that's always wrong. But if you're going to sign up for the military or police forces, this is violence that's authorized by the state. And so that position says personal violence is always wrong in your individual capacity, but political violence supporting or being supported by the state could be permitted. And then the anti-war pacifist, which says that personal violence could sometimes be right, but political violence and participation in war is always wrong. Then we talked about different reasons that he gives in favor of pacifism. I don't know, and by the way, good to see you too, Amanda. As I'm going to do, just kind of going forward a little bit to kind of keep tabs on all you guys, I'm just taking a quick snap of the names of the people that are here. So just let me do that. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate you for that. Okay, but anyway, moving on. One reason in favor of pacifism that he offers, he calls the biblical reason. Because in the Bible, as you may know, it's one of those fundamental precepts that's stated in the 10 Commandments that thou shalt not kill. And some people believe that that's a reasonable basis to be a pacifist, to just follow biblical requirements to the letter. It doesn't just say thou shalt not kill. There's other things too, like turn the other cheek and all those kinds of nice sentiments and statements that are found in the different scriptures. But there's some criticism to that, which we talked about. Obviously, some people think that if you translate the original Hebrew into English, the interpretation could be that it means thou shalt not murder as opposed to thou shalt not kill, which might give you a little bit more latitude to justifiably kill if it wasn't wrongful killing. Other people also find fault with this basis for pacifism because the Bible itself is a little bit inconsistent on the question of killing.
since even though it does say thou shalt not kill, there are other parts of the Bible where it seems to command killing in certain cases. And then there's also this even more basic issue that, does God even exist? Is the Bible true? Is it got any kind of authority? And does the things that are written in the Bible apply to everybody actually, or does it just apply to the people that are followers of the Bible? So then another reason that's given after that he talks about for pacifism is the idea of the sacredness of life, that life is sacred. And if you feel that life is sacred, you don't necessarily need to be a member of any religion to justifiably feel that way and to think that pacifism is an obligation because of the sacredness of life. Now, he says that there are definitely objections to this too, because, for example, sometimes it might be clear that killing is the only way to prevent the greater loss of life. And so if life is that sacred, shouldn't it be permitted to sometimes use lethal force if it's the only available means to prevent an even greater loss of life? And another reason is just the simple right to life. Some people try to avoid the problems with other justification for pacifism by just saying that people have a right to life and rights are more important than utilitarian considerations. So if you intentionally violate that, even in war, you'd be violating the right to life. But here again, an objection is possible. You could say that when we have rights, doesn't that come together with a right to act in whatever way is necessary to preserve or to protect the right, even if it requires lethal force sometimes? And then we were getting into his reasons in favor of anti-war pacifism more specifically just after that. The first big reason that he offers for anti-war pacifism is that in war, soldiers are killed. So the killing of soldiers could be seen as a problem morally that pacifism tries to address with a moral perspective or position. And I think that's kind of where we ran out of time. So let me get back into the typing of the notes. So here's one of those. Killing of soldiers. So in all wars, some number of soldiers are killed. And if we take the right to life seriously, some people may say that it extends all the way to those that are participants in war, even the soldiers. So why not be a pacifist in order to oppose the killing of soldiers? Now, in reaction to that, some people will say that the killing in war is just a matter of self-defense. And doesn't the anti-war pacifist at least concede that self-defense can occasionally be permitted? So objection. Not to worry, hey, Miana. So the first objection to this basis for anti-war pacifism, again, the basis that it involves the killing of soldiers, someone may reply to that by saying that, well, sure, soldiers are killed in war, but when they are killed in war, it's because they're a threat to the life of other soldiers. And that just means that people are acting in personal self-defense. Shouldn't that be morally permitted? Why should there be a moral prohibition on acting in self-defense? If you kill other people and you're just defending your own life, what's wrong with that, basically? But Lackey does have a counter to that objection. So here I'll write the reply. Let's try to make sure we don't lose track of the dialogue here. It's like he gives a reason for pacifism, then he states a potential objection, and then he tries to reply to the objection. So the reply that he gives is that you can only legitimately claim self-defense if you have no way to save your life except by killing, and that you did nothing to provoke the attack you're subjected to. So just writing this out. Give me a second to type it. So here's the counter that Lackey gives to this response, that shouldn't it be fair in war for the soldiers to kill other soldiers because they're just acting in self-defense? He says, well, is it really self-defense though? Because when you claim self-defense, if you have a legitimate case of self-defense, it has to be true, first off, that you have no other way to save your life except by killing. So if I thought that there was a threat to my life, but it no longer exists, and then I kill somebody because of that previous threat, you really can't call it self-defense. Suppose that somebody, I don't know, broke into my house and stole some things, and they're sprinting down the street far away from where I'm at, like 300 meters down. So I pull out like a rifle and like a sniper, I shoot them as they're like 300 meters away. You know that they did something wrong by violating your property rights, but at this point, you're not actually having your life threatened. And in connection to war, it's not often that when you kill other soldiers, the soldiers you're killing are because you're in a kill or be killed scenario. It's not like typically the war fighters are pressed with imminent death if they don't kill. Oftentimes, you're fighting from fortified bunkers or remote locations. We have all kinds of modern technology that allow us to deploy weapon systems from safe launching points. So when people are just pressing a button from inside a fortified bunker to release big munitions on like enemy forces, they're not actually in a kill or be killed scenario. So you can't exactly say that these are cases where if you hadn't killed, you would have died. You're killing in a way that is not necessarily in response to a direct imminent threat to your life. And in the second point, you also can't claim self-defense if unless you didn't do anything to provoke the attack that you're defending from. I gave this analogy last time on an individual level. If I rush up towards some stranger in public and I stab them like in the shoulder, and then they pull out a gun and they're like, okay, I'm going to try and defend myself. And then I'm like, wow, now that they pulled a gun out, I'm going to pull my gun out and I'm going to kill them first because now we have a self-defensive reason. It's not actually a correct case to make of self-defense, because if I'm the instigator and the aggressor to the whole conflict itself, then when people respond back to what I've done, I can't really call it self-defense because I was the initial aggressor. Even if I am threatened, even if my life is being threatened, as long as I'm the original attacker, it's not a genuine case of self-defense. And this relates back to war because the United States, our country, we're typically not invading countries that attacked us first. Since we have such powerful military forces and weapon systems, most countries know that they don't want to necessarily provoke, the wrath of the American military. So in most cases, when we invade another country, like whether it was Afghanistan or Iraq, let's take Iraq as a given example because it's pretty clear in connection to the point. We might be threatening them because we've just deployed all our forces and dropping bombs from the air and bringing in tanks and other things. So if we invade another country and that provokes a hostile response against our soldiers and military, it's not exactly straightforward to say, well, we're just acting in self-defense, because we, on par with the earlier analogy, could be perceived as the original perpetrators or instigators of the conflict. Now, another objection to the current point that it's wrong to involve yourself in war because it involves the killing of soldiers. So objection 2 is that, well, don't these soldiers assume the risks associated with military service and therefore, they become legitimate targets by their own choice? So second objection, some might say it's not actually morally problematic that soldiers are killed in war, because don't these soldiers, when they decide to enlist in the military, take a decision that they know full well could place them on the receiving end of enemy fire and being killed? So again, keeping in mind the big picture, Lackey's trying to justify anti-war pacifism on the basis that soldiers are killed in war. And on the one hand, someone may say, well, it's just self-defense when we kill soldiers in war, but he's tried to dismiss that point with the earlier comments I just raised. And another objection against that whole idea is that, well, it's not morally problematic for soldiers to be killed in war because they're taking their own choice to participate in the war. And when they do that, they may very well be killed because of the involvement in military fighting, but they know that. So if you knew what you were signing up for, then why is it morally bad for the soldiers to be killed? But he has a response to that too. So his reply to that point is that That only applies when you're talking about an all-volunteer army. So the response is this whole objection that, don't cry for the soldiers killed in war, or don't find it morally, problematic, because haven't they chosen of their own free will to put themselves in that risky situation? The response Lack gives to that is, well, that only would apply if we're talking about a soldier or soldiers who chose to enlist. It would have had to be their own decision to volunteer for the army, with the associated risks that carries, for us to say that removes any kind of moral problems when they're killed because they chose to take that risk. But he's telling us that, actually, in the United States, we might not be too aware of this because we haven't had a draft enlistment system since the Vietnam War. And it was hugely unpopular because obviously a lot of wealthy and well-connected people, when it's a randomized draft lottery, their children could be selected for war and then shipped out to Vietnam or wherever else. So since then, because of the sort of toxic political implications of having a draft military, we've done the volunteer military. And we've had like all kinds of programs that we've instituted to kind of incentivize military service, like the GI Bill that'll pay for your college tuition and other things like that. So only a wealthy nation with a lot of money like the United States can afford the kind of programs necessary to incentivize enough military enlistment that we can sustain an all-volunteer military. But that's not necessarily the norm around the world, especially in the kind of countries that we might get involved in fighting, like, say, Iraq or wherever. So when those soldiers are killed in war in conscription-based military forces or draft military forces, this objection wouldn't apply. And that's actually the general case. Only the wealthiest nations can afford the all-volunteer military and the programs needed to support the incentives for enlistment. And one more reply that he gives to that. So reply number 2. And this one's a little subtle, so let me just kind of work through it. I think now we've covered all. I've just kind of been able to summarize everything that we did last time. It took me a little while, but I wanted to make sure that I typed some of those notes in because it got a little bit messy at the end of the lecture last time, since my chat function and was kind of not functioning properly. So I did write some of those notes on the board last time, but now they're in the chat, which is a little bit better and cleaner. A second point of reply to this new objection that, soldiers assume the risks of being killed when they sign up military service is this. So responsibility for a bad outcome when a risk materializes. So let me write it here and then I'll explain it. Okay, so reply number 2, what it says in the chat is the primary responsibility for when a risk is realized, meaning that you took a risk and then the bad thing that is associated with the risk ended up happening. Like, I don't know, suppose that someone plays Russian roulette, when they point a gun at their head and there's a certain number of bullets in the chamber, but most of them are empty. Like, say there's just one in the six shooter holster. If that bad outcome happens and they end up shooting themselves, well, that's like the materialization or the realization of a risk. But now, as applied to the current topic, if, say, a person enlists in military service, or let's not say enlist, but someone's in the military fighting as a soldier, and then they get killed in the fighting, who's mostly responsible for the bad outcome here? This is the bad outcome of being killed after having, joined the military forces. Well, it wouldn't necessarily be the people who took on the risks associated with participating in the war. It would rather be more in the direct responsibility of those that created the risky situation in the first place, like the people who invaded and created the war itself. Here's an analogy that the author gives to make this point. So, example, arsonist versus Okay, I want you to imagine a situation really quick, okay? This will help to clarify the current topic or point. So suppose there was an arsonist who, by definition of arsonism, they set fire, right? And because they set this fire, it's now spread and it's set some homes on fire, as has happened and as can happen. So now there's a home that's burning. Suppose that currently no one's in the home; they've all gotten out, but one person that lives there wants to rush inside of the home to recover some precious, I don't know, like family items. Maybe it's photographs, maybe it's I don't know, their wedding dress, or a precious gift that was given to one of them by their parents that's now passed. I don't know, or it could be just simply recovering a pet. But they've rushed into the home. Now, when that person runs in the home, they're assuming a risk, as you can tell. The risk they're assuming is maybe something bad will happen. They could get caught up in the fire, the flames, or the smoke. But suppose that when they go in the house to recover those things, tragically, they can't make it out and they do end up dying in their effort to retrieve the items. Now, this would be the realization of the risk in the scenario we're talking about. But now, this person having died, who's primarily to blame? Is it the person who rushed into the house or the arsonist who made the house burn in the first place? If you're following the chat and the topic, can you maybe give me your thought? We are talking about an arsonist set fire. It causes a house to burn. A person who had lived there rushed in to try and get items out. They die in that attempt. Who gets most blame for the fact this person has died? The one that went in the house or the person who set the fire to begin with? If you could think about it, just let me know your hot take. The person that set the fire, Santino, yes, and that's the author's intuition too. Now, maybe they may have taken risks with their life, by taking the decision to go in, the person that was a, resident of the home. But more responsibility should probably be placed on the person who made the risky situation exist in the first place. So going back to our discussion of war, right? Say that you invade some country, and there are people in that country that then want to fight back. And those people that fight back end up getting killed. Now, you could argue, well, didn't they choose on their own to enlist in war, knowing full well that that could put them as a target? But if we instigated the conflict by invading a country, then we are the ones that generated the risky wartime conditions in the first place. And even if there are people who are willing to participate in fighting back and they assume certain risks, the bad outcome of their death, if it happens, he argues, should lie more not with those that are fighting as the soldiers, but with the people who are launching the war and creating a wartime scenario. So, like, say the United States, when we invaded Iraq, maybe some of those people that fought back weren't drafted in. Maybe some people just did want to, defend themselves in their country. But if they did that, we can't just say, well, it's on them then if they get killed because they shouldn't have signed up if they didn't want to take those risks. You could say that more responsibility actually lies with those that initiate or launch the war. And in that case, there would still be a moral problem with their deaths. So a second reason in favor of anti-war pacifism that he then mentions. So we've now discussed the first reason, the killing of soldiers, and the associated back and forth after that reason was given, the objections to the point of view, and then his attempt to rebut the objections. Now here's a second reason in favor of the same, of anti-war pacifism. And that is the killing of civilians. I would say this reason, at least to me, it speaks to me a little bit more because just off top of common sense, I think most people find the death of the civilians that are not fighting at all in a wartime situation to be a little bit more tragic and morally problematic, because whatever objections apply to soldiers definitely don't apply to the civilians that have in no way assumed risks for the war and are not at all threatening other people with weapons and attacks. So in ancient wars, killing was more comprehensive. War was total, and it included the killing and slaughter of civilians. But the general civilizing trend of the modern era has been, at least to try, to confine warfare only to those people that are combatants. But it's obviously impossible to avoid that altogether, the killing of some civilians. Some call that collateral damage. And Lackey's point is that since you know before the war begins that some number of civilians will be killed, wouldn't that be immoral because they're innocent people that are not at all fighting? To the pacifist, this killing is immoral. To the non-pacifist, they're just a regrettable side effect of war, but they're not necessarily murder. But Lackey really tries to press the point. He says, well, why wouldn't it be murder? The people are innocent, and you know in advance when the war is launched that some of them will die. Why is that not murder? Now, what's one reply to this? So we get into the back and forth, the reply, an objection to this, I should say. So one objection to that he talks about is, well, it's not the intended outcome that the civilians die, but it's just foreseeable. And how is that any different than certain peacetime policies that are similar in structure? So okay, so an objection to this current point that the killing of civilians is a basic reason to oppose war and to be a pacifist. Well, not to worry, Zach. It's good to see you too. And text not going through, Mary Jane. Since when? Since I wrote second reason in favor of anti-war pacifism, killing of civilians, or when? Let me know. That's okay, but where did it discontinue? Since example of arsonist above, arsonist versus person who rushes into burning home to recover items. Okay, not to worry. Let's go ahead and let me just give you this in a different format. So, second reason to be anti-war pacifist, the killing of civilians. So just make sure you're taking good notes. The killing of civilians, okay? Objection to that point, which I'll put over here. Just give me a second to kind of write it. I'm just taking it out. So the objection. The death of civilians is foreseen but not intended. This is the same as certain policies that are not morally problematic. Like raising the speed limit on highways. Okay, so we always have the board as a fallback. And there you see it, I'm typing. So, good. Now, you guys got everything about the whole arsonist thing. I think that's what we established. And basically now, we're going to go through this example. Okay, so, yeah, okay, good. Yeah, so you haven't lost too much. This is the notes that were in the chat that I was not able to get in there. One more chance, though, to check it.
I just wrote a test note. You're not seeing that, right? Just confirm if you can tell me that it's not coming through. Oh, you can? You see the test thing? Okay, well, let me ask you. It could be censorship, I'm sure it is, but we'll get around it either way. Um, what did I just write? Just making sure that that's not just a one-off. Yeah, unaliving citizen, sure, killing citizen. Tomato, okay, just double checking. All right. Well, anyway, look, you see it on the board. To anyone YouTube censors or others, algorithms, you need to understand this is a college class. We're just discussing essays in a philosophy textbook published by Oxford University Press. This is the major #1 publisher of philosophy texts in the whole world, and this is just an established class with a certain number of topics. Anyway, though, we're coming back to this, and I'll continue typing. Maybe since now the typing function is still working, it's not gonna like prevent me from typing certain things. I'll just have to be a little bit more creative about how I'm trying to word the certain things. So let me work through this with you. Another reason to be an anti-war pacifist, the killing of civilians, and we've talked about that. What's an objection to that being a problem? Well, you could say that when civilians are killed in war, even though we can see in advance, we foresee that will happen, it's not the intended outcome. And how is that any different than certain policies that we accept in peacetime that we don't raise moral problems with? Like, for example, raising the speed limit on highways. Okay, so let me talk about the whole example of raising the speed limit on a highway. So obviously cars haven't always existed. When they first came out a long time ago, they weren't that fast. But then we developed more powerful engines and, better roadways and everything. So it got to the point where cars were capable of going faster. Now, originally, you might have thought the speed limits, they could have been a little lower, but then they upgraded them after a while so that people could travel faster on the freeway systems and get from point A to B a little bit more efficiently, a little bit more quickly. But when they raised these speed limits, okay, what's one foreseen side effect of that we don't intend, but we know already when we make the policy decision, when legislators go to vote, and they approve these laws. One thing that is a not great thing that's going to happen as a result of raising the speed limit is that it's going to lead to a certain greater number of what? When people are legally permitted to drive faster on the roads, you can tell that that's going to result in one not very good thing, which is what? When you raise the speed limits, there's going to be the capacity for people to drive faster, and that can produce more what? More accidents. Not just more accidents, but more fatalities and more fatal accidents. When people are not legally permitted to drive, like, say, more than 35 miles per hour, even if they do get into a collision at those legal limit speeds, they're not going to be as likely to cause a fatal injury because it's just not as high impact, the collisions that could happen at that speed. But when you're allowing people to now go, like, say, 55 and then 65, and then, there are some zones where you can go 70, when the limit of the speed is legally permitted to be higher, then you're facilitating a greater number of civilian deaths on the roadways, knowing full well that that's going to happen, but it's not the intended result. What's the real reason that these upgraded speed limits were decided on? Not to cause more death or injury, even though, of course, that does happen as a result of it, but it's simply to facilitate greater speed with travel. So look, when these speed limits are raised, you can foresee that some civilians will die in greater numbers. Actually, the death of Americans on the roads is one of the leading causes of death and injury for people between the ages of 15 and 44. So it's actually kind of one of the bigger causes of mortality from accident or injury like that. But anyway, when the speed limits were raised, a foreseeable consequence of that is that greater number of people are going to die from these kind of higher impact collisions, but that's not the intended outcome. And people don't look at the legislators as murderers or whatever for allowing those speed limits to increase. So going back to war, you could argue that will some civilians be killed? Yeah. But what we're really fighting the war for is not for the sake of killing innocent civilians. It's for the sake of defending ourselves or returning to a peacetime status quo after some aggressor maybe attacked us in the ideal case. So what's the problem then with the killing of civilians in war? Isn't it on par and parallel to these increased number of deaths on the road that would occur as a byproduct of raising the speed limits? But he has a response to that. So let me tell you what his reply is to this objection.
He says that the case of the upgraded speed limits and going to war are not alike in a morally similar way, in a morally relevant way. So, reply. Okay, so it says the example of raising speed limits and launching war are not similar in this morally relevant way, and the difference, the major distinction between the two, is that in the case of the policy change to upgrade the speed limits, those rules are consented to by the democratic process. So not to worry, Sammy, you just do your best with the internet connection you got. But what it says here is, in the case of raising the speed limits, the public that is the ones that would be facing the additional risks, they do legitimately assume the risks associated with that through the democratic process, unlike the civilian victims of war. By the way, can you guys see this current comment that I've typed, the last two? Just double checking, making sure that that's in the chat. But I'm going to comment on it anyway. Okay, good. Thank you. So you could say this. When these speed limits are raised, it's not like a risk is imposed on us against our will. It's a democratic system, right? So we actually are willing to accept the risks ourselves, and it's indirectly consented to by the process of democracy. So if we really didn't want for these speed limits to be raised, and we thought that it was too much of a public safety concern and too many people dying because of that, then we could always do what? We could always mobilize a political coalition, go out there, march, lobby, picket, write letters to your congressperson, and we could say things like, you know what, let's get rid of all these bums that are voting for these higher speed limits. We demand as the public that change. And if we wanted to, and if it was a really big enough deal to all of us, then we could make the legislators that we appoint to their offices vote differently on the issue and either not enhance or even reduce those speed limits. But we're not doing that. So what that shows is that we're willing to take on the risks of greater speed limits if it's compensated for by making more efficient travel and faster, speedier travel. But now consider the case of the civilian victims of war that are being compared by the critic here. They're really not similar because those civilian victims of war, they haven't consented to the risks of having like bombs falling on their home or family through any kind of democratic process. Like the people in Iraq, for example, that were faced with all kind of threats of life and well-being when we invaded that country. It's not like they made a joint political decision as a democratic society to invite those risks on themselves. So this objection then is kind of like defeated, he thinks, because the comparison between the two things is really not so analogous. Yes, there are foreseeable but unintended deaths that can arise as a result of certain policy changes, but it's not exactly like the case of war that it's being compared to, because there's that different factor of public consent to the risks through democratic approval of the laws, unlike the case of those civilian victims of warfare. So, like, just looking at my notes really quick, the defender of pacifism reminds us that in the policy case, the rules are consented to by the democratic process. That means the public assumes the risk legitimately, unlike the civilian victims of war. Now, some people might try to hold on to the point just one stage farther and say, but don't they legitimately assume the risk by remaining in the place where the war is happening? If they didn't want to have those risks, then couldn't they just leave and evacuate the war? But that would mean in most cases that you'd become a refugee of war and you'd have to like find some other country to take you in. And that is a decision that takes so much personal sacrifice. Like imagine uprooting yourself from your whole family, your culture, your friends that you've bonded with over time to try and escape the dangers of a war zone. Since that is such a difficult decision to do, and it requires so much sacrifice, it really can't be called a free choice. So basically what he's saying is you can't just say, well, if you stay in the war zone with your family, you're willing to assume the risks of, getting caught up in the crossfire of war. But it's not a free choice to just like leave a country if you don't like the risks associated with war that's breaking out in the country, particularly when, you haven't chosen this war for yourself or for your country. And one last reason to be a pacifist that he gives at the very end. Okay, so this is the last one. So third reason in favor of anti-war pacifism is what he calls the balance of good and evil in war. And I'll just kind of make short work of this, and then we'll move on to the next author that's listed. So the balance of good and evil in war, here's what he says by means of that you could also justify anti-war pacifism by saying that if you're just going to weigh the costs of war against the benefits, it's never been a winning proposition. It's never generated more value or benefit than harm. So if you add up all the death, destruction, loss of life and property, and the expense of treasure, and you weigh that against how much goodness that the war generates, there's never been any great moral good achieved in war that could overcome the harms. So So the harms of war always outweigh the benefits or good achieved by the war. This is kind of almost like a cost-benefit utilitarian style basis to be an anti-war pacifist. And that actually would require you to go back into some of the wars that have been fought and look at them case by case and make the analysis that if you look at it in total, it didn't generate enough benefit to offset all the harms. Now, for him to make the case on that, he actually talks about some of the most popular wars that have ever happened, and he tries to show that even those that are generally regarded as valuable and worthwhile, there could still be an argument made that they didn't have enough, that they caused so much harm that still, notwithstanding the benefits, it wasn't enough to justify it. He starts off kind of on some easier cases. Like he starts by talking about the Mexican-American War. So some of you may know, if you know a little bit about history, that like where we're at right now, if you're in California, this entire state and like big parts of the United States, they used to belong to Mexico. And the possession of that land was transferred over to America in large part because of the outcome of the Mexican-American War. Now, what are the benefits of the Mexican-American War? It's just a transfer of land from Mexico to America. And you could say that was good for the United States in some sense, but it's not necessarily a great moral good because we had no like moral claim to the territory that was ceded to us. So no great injustice would have persisted if the war had not been fought. If the war between America and Mexico wasn't fought, then America would just be a little bit smaller, and Mexico would have had its previous territorial borders. But not having that not having this change because the war had been fought wouldn't have resulted in some kind of great moral evil. It would just have been a redrawn boundaries between the two countries. But we also would have had all the people that died and were killed still alive, or not still alive because it's so far in the past, but they wouldn't have died in war, at least in that violent way. So, looking at that war, even if many Americans probably think that it was valuable because, we took over big parts of land, you can't really say that it was necessarily enough moral good to offset the harms and losses that occurred in the same conflict. Then he goes into some of the really tough ones. Well, let me start off a little easier. Next, let's talk about World War I. Now, I think even historians and scholars mostly regard World War I as kind of like a big military adventure that didn't really suit anyone's purposes because it was the first major global conflict where we had some more advanced weapons like machine guns and landmines and aerial munitions being dropped from the sky. None of that existed, of course, back in the 1800s and prior to the 20th century. So once we get in the turn of the 20th century, closely following after that, there's World War I, all these nations fighting. Now, it was kind of a stalemate in the end. Not much benefit happened in any of the sides that were warring over World War I. So all you can really look at in that case is the stacking up of like a whole bunch of death and destruction against no great moral benefit or even
tactical benefit really for any of the countries that participated. So it's easy to maybe make the case that that was a worthless war or a war where the harms outweighed the benefits. But then he talks about, say, the American Revolutionary War, and I know we've all been taught that that was like a very important war with a great morally good outcome, the establishment of the United States, our country, and all the great things the United States has done since then. But what he points out, which is interesting, is that suppose we hadn't decided to fight a war against Britain when we were those 13 original colonies from Britain, what would have happened? Well, we would have had a future in that case that would have been similar to the case of Canada, which didn't rebel against the monarch, but maintained allegiance to them. But when you look at Canada, you can't really say, well, God, it was a good thing we fought the Revolutionary War because otherwise we would have been like Canada. It's not exactly like some great moral injustice is happening over there that we avoided by fighting, whereas they didn't. So, you could argue that that's not the right analysis, but he says that, and I'll read his words here. It says, the Revolutionary War in America is widely viewed as a war that produced a great moral good. But if the war had not been fought, the history of the United States would be similar to the history of Canada, which remained loyal. And no one really feels that the Canadians have suffered or are suffering great injustices that the American colonies avoided by war. Likewise, so yeah, that's what he says about that one. And finally, he gets to World War II, which I think is the hardest case for him to make because pretty overwhelmingly, most all historians and observers of history do think that that was worthwhile because we avoided the consolidation of power by Nazi Germany and Hitler. We prevented the more wholesale destruction of European Jews. So wouldn't that be an example of a righteous, justified war? Well, even there, he says, let me read some of the words because he puts it better than I could probably summarize it. He first talks about the massive number of people that died in World War II. And so he says it's commonly estimated that 35 million people died as a result of World War II. And so that's a lot of people, 35 million. He says it's difficult to imagine that any cause could justify so much death, but the Allies only need to justify their share of the killings. Between 1939 and 1945, Allied forces killed about 5.5 million Axis soldiers and about 1 million civilians in Axis countries. Suppose that Britain and the United States had chosen to stay out of World War II, and suppose that Stalin, like Lenin, surrendered to Germany shortly after the invasion. Does avoiding the world that would have resulted from those decisions justify killing 6.5 million people? And then he gets into a little bit of informed speculation about what the case would have been if counterfactually we hadn't fought. He says if Hitler and Tojo had won the war, doubtless they would have killed a great many people both before and after victory, but it's quite likely that the total of additional victims beyond those they had already killed in the war that was fought would have been less than 6.5 million, and at any rate, the responsibility for those deaths would fall on Hitler and not on the Allies. If Hitler had won the war, large portions of the world would have fallen under foreign domination perhaps for a long time, but the anti-war pacifists will point out that the main areas of Axis domination, China and Russia, were not places where the citizens had a high level of freedom before the war began anyway. So what he's saying is if Hitler had been allowed to sort of run wild and make greater inroads into his kind of imperial ambitions, Axis domination would have prevailed more prominently in China and Russia, which are countries that didn't necessarily have high levels of freedom and liberty to begin with. So avoiding that might not have been this great moral good as he analyzes it. He says perhaps the majority of people in the conquered areas would have worked out a accord with their new rulers, as did the majority of French citizens during German occupation. But it can't be argued that World War II was necessary to save 6 million Jews from annihilation in the Holocaust because the war, in fact, did not save them. So at the end, he says that even some of the most popular and romanticized global conflicts like World War II, like the Revolutionary War of America, you could be seeing them from another angle and take a more critical perspective on whether they did, in fact, generate enough moral good to offset the harms and losses and killing that they did also involve. And he kind of has a sort of poignant thought at the very end, which is like, the dead, they can't weigh in. All the millions of people that died in these wars, they're gone. So they can't say what their perspective is on whether the war was justified or not. So someone might want to think in terms of speaking for them. So he says, no one denies that Nazi victory in World War II would have had terrible, frightful results, but according to anti-war pacifism, killing 6.5 million people is also pretty bad, and preventing one moral wrong does not obviously outweigh committing another. Very few people today share the pacifist condemnation of World War II, but perhaps that's because the dead killed by the Allies cannot speak up and make sure that their losses are properly weighed in the moral balance of things. So anyway, that's Douglas Lackey. We've now learned about his kind of comprehensive argument for pacifism on a couple different bases. He lays out 4 different varieties of pacifism.
He then tries to get reasons for just general pacifism. He considers objections to them. He tries to respond to them. Then he gives us these three main reasons for anti-war pacifism: the killing of soldiers, civilians, and the total balance of good and evil in war. And he thinks that there's at least some kind of fair argument to be made on all these bases that you should take seriously pacifistic or anti-war pacifistic perspectives. With that, then, I'm going to continue moving through the next author. There's not as much to say about the next author, so maybe I'll just give you as much as we can fit in with the remaining 25 minutes, and then on Thursday, we'll kind of close our notes before we head to spring break with one more paper on this topic, and then we'll be starting a new topic when we come back. So the next author's name is Jan Narveson. I'm just going to clear the board here so I can write a little bit of stuff on him and to kind of remove the earlier info. Jan Narveson's paper is called Pacifism, a Philosophical Analysis, and he's not a pacifist. So he's going to kind of just be the opponent, really, of the kind of argument that was provided by the last author, Douglas Lackey. So Narveson's goal is pretty simple. He just wants to try and persuade the reader that pacifism is not a defensible view. In fact, he even thinks, moreover, that it's incoherent. So it's incoherent and morally indefensible. He starts by trying to make clear the notion of pacifism that he wants to criticize. So he thinks the concept of pacifism is actually more radical than some people believe. Pacifism, as he puts it, is not just that violence is bad, because everyone can agree with that, whether you're a pacifist or not. It's going farther. It's the idea that it's morally wrong to use force to resist, punish, or prevent violence. So this is his definition of it. Not to worry, Anthony. Thank you, and I appreciate you letting me know. But have a good presentation for sure. And just you can watch the last part of it later. So here we go. This is Narveson's brief definition of pacifism. And again, he's going to try and attack this whole concept and this notion. But to him, pacifism is basically as such, that it is morally wrong to use force. Let me type it here. To any of these things, to resist, punish, or prevent violence. Okay, so he says that's the basic concept of pacifism, that it's wrong to use force for any of these very fundamental reasons: to resist violence, to punish violence, or to prevent violence. And to him, this is extreme, this is radical, but even more, it's self-contradictory and it's internally inconsistent. So he has questions for the pacifist that holds this point of view. First off, how much violence should not be resisted? Now, surely if somebody comes and gives me a little pinch on the arm, it would probably be wrong for me to just kill them as a response. We can probably all agree that that would be way out of line, that would be disproportionate. But how much violence should not be resisted with force? Does any level of violence committed against me not justifiably entitle me to some kind of forceful response? The pinch on the arm case, probably it's not morally acceptable for me to kill in response. But as we level up the violence that's being taken on me, is there any sort of threshold or boundary where if we cross that line, now it's okay for me to use force? So one question is, how much violence should not be resisted? Another question, what degree of force is not justified in responding to violence? So if you say I should be a pacifist and you say that means I shouldn't act in a way that's violent, well, what counts as a violent response? If I kill someone, pretty obviously that's violent. But what if I don't kill them? All I do is I just tackle them, or I try to disarm them by using some kind of moderate level of force. What if I just pin their arms in a way that they can no longer reach a weapon or punch at me? Is that force because I'm laying hands on the person, even if it doesn't represent I guess, something that's attempting to kill them or whatever? So he thinks there's also a little bit of lack of clarity in the specification of what I'm not permitted to do under the idea of pacifism. How much force am I not allowed to respond to? And what are the limits of what constitutes a forceful response? The pacifist should also say, yeah, like I just mentioned, what constitutes a violent response? Is it okay to pin someone's arms if I'm causing them no pain? These are unsettled questions that he thinks the pacifist just kind of leaves hanging. Another question for the pacifist is this: who should not resist violence? Some people say it's only the pacifists themselves that shouldn't act in a way that's violent. Others say that it's all people. He, I think, believes that to really be a pacifist, you have to hold the stronger view that it's everyone that should not use force or violence, not just a select group of people that prefer not to do it. So he has now a couple of points that he wants to try and make throughout the course of his essay. So 3 points from Narveson. Number 1, only the doctrine that all ought not resist is the coherent doctrine of pacifism. So 1 point is, he argues, pacifists, in order to be coherent with their own viewpoint, must hold the view that all people should not use violence, should say ought not resist violence with violence. Let me just put a little quick edit below. Sorry if you see the little typo, I just corrected it. But anyway, 1 point Narveson wants to try and show and prove is that pacifists, the correct position that they must hold to be internally consistent is that everyone should not resist violence with violence, not just some people, but everyone shouldn't use violence. Second, he says that that doctrine is logically untenable. So pacifists think that no one should ever use violence to resist violence, but he also now, second point, says that that is logically incoherent and inconsistent. And 3, his third point, is that pacifism has only got any support, or at least he thinks, it's only got any support because people fail to see how radical the doctrine really is. Okay, so 3 main points that sort of structure a lot of what he'll say. First off, that to be a pacifist, you'd have to really believe that no one should ever use violence to resist violence at all, and that that doctrine is actually logically incoherent. And then furthermore, that why are anybody supporting pacifism? At least he believes that it's just because they don't actually recognize or realize how radical, how extreme the viewpoint is. So then he continues to sort of describe and explain the moral force of the concept. He mentions this, obviously one who turns the other cheek, as they say in the Bible, I don't know if you know the biblical proverb that I'm referring to, but there's a passage in the Bible where it says, if a person smites you on the cheek, like they hit you on the head or whatever, the cheek, offer up the other cheek, turn the other cheek and be like, okay, hit this one too. That's supposed to be an expression of a pacifist idea that, instead of trying to retaliate against violence that people are committing, show them that you're not willing to act the same way in this kind of very vivid expression of pacifism. Now, if a person turns the other cheek, obviously they haven't done anything wrong. So a pacifist can't just say that it's not wrong to turn the other cheek. They have to say that we're obligated to turn the other cheek. A pacifist can't just say we may prefer to not resist, because the non-pacifist could say the same. So to really be a pacifist, you have to think that we must turn the other cheek. We must not return force with force. But what are the implications of holding that view as a moral principle? It's a view that implies that this is something that has to be incumbent on everybody, that everyone has an obligation to not resist force with force. Now, why think that we have such a duty? And again, he kind of sides with one thing that Lackey said, that you can't be a true pacifist and think that that position only pertains to you. You can't think that it only applies to you and not others, because then it would just be a personal choice or a lifestyle preference, but not a moral perspective. So this leads him to his kind of full, mature statement of what he thinks pacifism entails, and that's on page 416. And if I'm reading it here, what he says is, just getting to the right quote. 1 second. Yeah, so it says on the right column of 416, pacifism then must be the principle that the use of force to meet force is wrong as such. That is, that nobody may do so. So the problem here, he thinks, is obvious. The position of pacifism is one that he doesn't think we can coherently express and maintain rational consistency. So some people will try to justify pacifism by saying that if you're a pacifist, you're going to bring the aggressor to your way of thinking. Maybe if the aggressor strikes you and then you offer up the other cheek, they'll be like, wait a minute, I'm being aggressive and this person is completely passive. Therefore, I should change my ways. So he says some people will encourage pacifism as a tactic because they think that it's actually going to flip people who see the pacifistic attitude displayed in your behavior as a reason to disengage from further violence. But there's an obvious problem with that. It would then depend on what the probable effect of a pacifistic attitude is on the aggressor. And maybe some aggressors will just have their heart melted by the exhibition of a pacifistic behavior on a person. But he says that can't be said in all cases. It just depends on the individual aggressor. And in history, some historical episodes do cast doubt on that probable effect. Like, for example, when the Nazis saw people trying to act in ways that were pacifistic, turning the other cheek and stuff, some of them just became more aggressive. It almost egged them on, as he says here. So maybe I'll put a quick note in the chat just so that you understand this. Okay, so I just typed out, some pacifists say that if you show nonviolence in response to being attacked, that will convert the aggressor to pacifism too. And wouldn't that be great? Now we're going to get more and more people that are peaceful and nonviolent because they're just going to be won over to the idea of pacifism through your, principled display of nonviolence. But Narveson doesn't agree. He says that isn't true, and it just depends on the character of the given aggressor. So yeah, Narveson says that's not true. Sorry for the double repeating of the word, but Narveson says that's not true because it just depends on the character of the given aggressor. You can't say that all aggressors are going to have their willingness to commit violence changed from being presented with a pacifist victim. And he talks about that. So he says, it's not my intention to discuss matters of fact as such, but it's worthwhile to point out that in history of the human race, there's no support for the supposition that turning the other cheek always makes the aggressor passive. Some aggressors, such as the Nazis, were just egged on by the pacifist attitude of their victims. Some of the SS men apparently became curious to see just how much torture the victim would put up with before they began to resist. So, in the British colonizers, when Gandhi and the Indians that were led by his nonviolent movement withheld on violence, that did in fact cause some of them to relinquish violent methods and to, pull back from colonization of India, but it didn't work on the Nazis. So he just says, you can't say that that's a general truth, that always converts people to pacifism. If it did, it might be another powerful reason in favor of it, but he denies that by looking at these historical episodes. So again, as he says on 417, just kind of reiterating the sort of extreme nature of the pacifist perspective that he wants to attack. He says on the right column, the pacifist must then, sorry, let me get the right quote. Okay, so right here he says, it appears then that to hold the pacifist position as a genuine full-blooded moral principle is to hold that nobody has a right to fight back when attacked, that fighting back is inherently evil as such. It means that we are all mistaken in supposing that we have a right of self-protection. And of course, this is an extreme and extraordinary position. We have no right to punish, prevent, or counter violence with violence. And that's just all unjust. So it's this version of pacifism, this extreme kind of starkly presented version of it, that he wants to make the subject of his criticism. Now, if a pacifist doesn't like this characterization of their view, he believes they might try to revert to a modified version of pacifism, a more moderate version of it, to make it sound more defensible or persuasive. So he thinks here, being kind of cornered with how radical the view seems, they might try to conciliate a little bit and offer this more modified statement of pacifism. So here we go. But he's gonna reject that too. But here's what he thinks the moderate pacifist is maybe going to offer in response to these critiques. The moderate pacifist will say that if you're capable of defending yourself, then you should not, on principle. But if you see defenseless people being attacked, then it's okay for you to defend them. So moderate pacifism. This is what he thinks might be the pacifist position of last resort if the other one seems too extreme. The extreme view being like you should never use violence for any reason, no matter whether you're being attacked or not. A moderate pacifist might try to sort of meet in the middle and say this. So if you're like a big, strong, able-bodied person and you're easily capable of defending yourself, then you should withhold on the self-defense just on pure pacifist principle. But if you see another defenseless individual that's being attacked and they do not have the means of personal self-defense, then you can rush to their aid and provide defense against the defenseless. So the moderate pacifist is maybe going to say, don't defend the defendable, but do defend the defenseless. And that might open up a little bit of, space for some acts of violence committed against others, but only if what? Only if you're defending defenseless people. So what about the moderate pacifist view? Does this have a better run of common sense, or is this likelier to bypass his objections? Well, he's going to try and break this down and criticize it too. So again, I'm going to summarize what I've just said. A pacifist who doesn't like being characterized as a person who believes never is violence okay might try to revert to the view that the prohibition is only against defending oneself, but not other defenseless people. Perhaps the pacifist would say in this case that you may defend only the defenseless. And I'll read you his words on page 417 where he expresses this moderate pacifist view. So he says on the right column of 417, close to the bottom, the pacifist must retreat in order to avoid talking nonsense. So his next move might be to say that we have a right to defend all those who are not able to defend themselves. Big, grown-up men who are able to defend themselves ought not do so, but they ought to defend mere helpless children, for example, who are not able to defend themselves. But to Narveson, this is also incoherent, because suppose that there's a group of individuals that can defend themselves together but not alone. It looks like when they assemble, they no longer have the moral justifiability to defend themselves because they are no longer defenseless. So whenever a person can defend, according to this view, he shouldn't, because then he and the defenseless form a defensive unit which can defend itself. So he gives us this concept of a defensive unit. Sounds like a football term, but in his usage, it has nothing to do with that. So let me explain. So say there's this person here, this little guy, who's being attacked by like this bigger, stronger guy. Okay, so I'm supposed to be an arrow pointing at him. Like, say he's attacking. Okay, so this guy's defenseless. He's outmanned, overwhelmed by how much stronger and more powerful this person is. Now, suppose that you're on the scene and you see this happening, right? And you're like, okay, well, I'm going to go and help this person because they're defenseless. Now, me and this other guy, if he attacked me, I would just say, sir, I'm not going to respond with violence because I'm a pacifist. If I'm a person capable of self-defense, I'm going to withhold on it because I don't believe in that when I'm capable of defending myself. But to the defenseless person, I'm going to help him out. Now, he says here, what is this new unit that's been formed by the formerly defenseless individual and the person that's coming to their aid. He calls that a defensive unit. So the defensive unit is the collection of individuals that is formed when the formerly defenseless person is assisted, when they're joined forces with by like a stronger, more powerful person that can provide the defense for them. A question to anyone with the chat right now, and this is getting close to the end, obviously, so we'll close soon, but this person is defenseless against him, but what about the whole defensive unit taken as a whole? Is the defensive unit defenseless against this person or no? I hope you could see through the tricky framing and language here, but yeah, the defensive unit by definition is not defenseless. That was the whole point of you going to help this person. But if the defensive unit's not defenseless, then go back to this moderate statement of pacifism. What it says is, when you're capable of defense, you shouldn't. When the thing's defenseless, you can help. But it starts to fall apart logically, because suppose that you do go to the side of assisting a defenseless person. Now, because you're helping them, they're no longer defenseless, because they, together with you, form this collective defensive unit. So it sounds like when you are capable of defense, you shouldn't do it. But if you help a defenseless person, they're no longer defenseless. So I guess as soon as you help a person, then you should withhold on defense. It starts to make it seem as though, again, there's not any room for justified defense in a true pacifist perspective or position, which is what he's trying to characterize the pacifist position to be at all along. And more fundamentally, we could ask, why should the moderate pacifist be willing to concede the point that defenseless people should be defended? Isn't that inconsistent with their overall theory or view? Because it's advocating us to intentionally become defenseless on purpose by refusing to defend. That's what pacifism seems to imply. So he thinks that any effort to try and create some limited permissibility for certain acts of defensive violence falls apart when tested by pacifist intuitions. So once again, he repeats his bigger point. He characterizes the only consistent pacifist position as the extreme view that no one should ever be defended for any potential reason. At the end, he says, looking at that view in its sort of stark, radical, extreme nature, the whole point of pacifism is to be radically opposed to violence, right? Why would you be a pacifist? Because you really believe violence is wrong and you refuse to engage in it. But think about it, he says. Normally, how far you're opposed to something would be reflected in how much effort you'd be willing to put out against that thing. To say you're radically opposed to something, but you would not be willing to do anything to prevent it or stop it, he thinks that's hypocritical. So he says, how can a pacifist consistently say this? I don't believe in violence. I'm super opposed to violence. But if violence starts happening, I'm not going to do anything to stop it. If you really are opposed to something and you have a passionate moral position against it, then wouldn't that be matched with the degree of willingness that you have to try and stop those things? Now, of course, the pacifist will say, it's not that I believe you shouldn't do anything to prevent violence. They'll just say that I don't think we should be allowed to use violence to prevent or to retaliate against violence. But what are the alternatives to violence in terms of stopping violence? Well, I guess one alternative is to try and talk to the parties that are engaged in violence and convince them of the error of their ways, to make moral arguments or to use rational persuasion. But he says rational persuasion is an alternative to violence, but it's usually not going to be enough to stop someone who's committed to acting in a way that is violent. If you have, like, say, like a mass shooter that's out there just taking shots at people and killing them, do you really think that it's going to be possible to just negotiate or discuss matters with them so that they will relinquish their willingness to commit violence? I mean, by the time someone's attacking, they're too busy engaged in violence to be persuaded otherwise. So he thinks that it's kind of just perhaps naive to believe that there are means of avoiding violence as a way of suppressing violence that are just as effective. In many cases, arguing and making a logical, reasonable case against violence is not going to be sufficient to really deter or stop people from engaging in it. So what if force is the only way to stop a violent attack? He thinks that in that case, it becomes morally justified, and even people who believe in nonviolence should agree to that, he thinks. But that's kind of me just rushing through some of those notes on Narveson. I think we pretty much got it all in, which is good. That sets us up for a good meeting on Thursday. So we have one more lesson before we go away to the spring break. and that's on Thursday. Yeah, the alternative would be a fighting fire with fire mentality, but he doesn't just say that we should want violence. He just says, it's more realistic to oppose violence with violence, at least in some cases where there's no real chance that the violent attacker is going to be willing to change unless you neutralize them with force. But on Thursday, it's Andrew Valls. So I'd like you guys to try and read the Valls article. This is about his argument that whether terrorism could ever be morally justified. So we'll look at that, we'll study it, and then we'll be off to the spring break. I'm going to be posting another set of essay prompts, but I have to wait a little bit because it will deal with a topic that we will get into as we return from spring break. So just hold off on that for a while, and you'll have at least a few weeks to work on it. But for everybody that's here, please feel free to say, goodbye and sign off. And, I appreciate you guys' attendance just as always. So thanks again. Have a good one. And we'll be back here live on Thursday. Okay. Thanks, chat. Good to see you guys, and see you soon. Talk to you soon.